Hello, Professor Darr. So as it has already been said, you're an associate professor of communications and magazine news and digital journalism in the Newhouse School of Public Communications at Syracuse University. Thank you so much for being there. You study political behavior, campaign strategy, and local media. And in 2022, you received the prestigious Andrew Carnegie Fellowship for your project, partnering with local news to reduce polarization, so the topic of the conference today, which investigates the ways that newsroom can earn back trust and reduce political polarization through their coverage of local and national politics. So yeah, welcome.
Thank you, great to be here.
So to start this off, and for the first question, maybe we just set the context and have you explain to us really briefly what news deserts are and how serious this phenomenon is.
Absolutely. So there has been a strong, precipitous decline in local news in America, which on one hand means it started from a place of strength. There was a lot of room to fall. America has a long tradition of local news sources, daily, weekly newspapers, local radio, local television, which is the most trusted source of news to this day in America, is local television news of any kind. And there is a growing worry because of the steep declines in industry that Sewell's charts showed so clearly, that people are going to be left without news. And these news deserts are one way that that's talked about. I'm not sure if it's my favorite term because it implies a lack of information, and of course there is still information going around. It just may not be running through the standards of journalism in a way that our people in this room, I believe, value. I think that, however, a lot of these news deserts that have opened up, defined roughly as a county not having a newspaper located within it. I would argue areas that are further away from the metropolitan area that the news outlets serve. A lot of people are in markets but not close to those cities. It's problematic because people might be getting information from other places. However, I think focusing on news deserts overlooks broader trends in the industries that are also bad. I'm as worried, if not more, about the notion of ghost newspapers or sources that simply that may exist with the same name that they had before, but are not publishing original local reporting. They are publishing largely wire stories, and they're operating with far fewer reporters than they once did, so that might not be classified as a desert, but we should be afraid of the ghosts, I guess, is the point there. And so it's a serious, precipitous change. Again, Sewell Chan's charts were very good for this, that dropped, starting in roughly 2005, 2006 with the financial crisis. But there's been a real change in the amount of original local reporting being produced, almost always downward in these areas. And we end up talking a lot about national politics, and we'll talk about the nationalization of politics, I think, a lot in this panel. But we need to not just focus on what's new in the marketplace for news. It's very easy to do that. We have to focus on what are the effects of losing what we already had a lot of and not having as much of it as we did.
So to follow up on that, what role do you think that this phenomenon plays in polarization of communities? Because, Dr. Chan also mentioned while he was talking, and he referred to you, and he said that trust versus distrust is a big phenomenon that you look at when you talk national coverage versus local coverage. So maybe if you could analyze that for us.
Absolutely. So polarization, I like to start by defining it because it can often mean whatever you want it to mean. It can be used as sort of a catch-all term for things people don't like about politics. But polarization fundamentally means distance. It means that you're farther away from each other on things, which makes it harder to meet in the middle. This often means distance between the two national political parties. I like to also think of it as distance from your news or from the focus of what your preferred news is reporting on. and yourself and your daily life. And national news is generally going to be further away from people than local, particularly in the US, again, 5 time zones, as previously noted. And so what happens when people are further away from where they see politics happening? This is a function of the nationalization of news that I don't think it's talked about enough. We end up thinking national politics is politics, is the be-all, end-all. And that is not necessarily the case in America. Now, in other countries where there's a more powerful centralized national government, that's one thing. Historically, that has not been true in America, although there's been a gradual nationalization of politics. I think that polarization and nationalization go hand in hand, and we've focused more on polarization as a field. I'm speaking more as a political scientist here. But this notion that politics is just this, in America, is just this existential battle between Republicans and Democrats that happens in Washington, D.C., does not map onto local communities even today. Now, maybe more than it used to, but local issues, unlike most other aspects of identity, perhaps nationally, what car you drive, what religion you are, these things tend to fall more neatly into one party or the other than they used to, which is part of the process of polarization. But on the local level, there are strong conflicts, there are important issues, and they don't map as neatly onto the 2 political parties in America. And as a result, reporting on those controversies, reporting on those factors at the local level should be naturally depolarizing because it does not re-emphasize partisan identities. And in today's politics, anything that does not emphasize national politics and political divisions between Republicans and Democrats, real though they are, is going to be depolarizing.
And yeah, after defining what's polarization, maybe it'd be interesting to hear more about how you're measuring polarization. And you've been writing with Matthew Hitz and Joanna Dunaway a book in 2021 called Home-Style Opinion, How Local Newspaper Can Slow Polarization. So maybe we'd like to hear more about what has been done for this book, maybe about your survey and how you were measuring polarization.
Absolutely. So this book was a really cool opportunity that sort of presented itself to us. We wrote an article in 2018 showing that where local newspapers closed, polarization increased. Again, to the point of like, I wish Media Matters didn't have to exist. I wish there wasn't such a large sample of local newspapers closing that we could have used in that article, but we used a nationwide sample to show that split ticket voting, where you vote for one or more parties up and down the ballot, or more than one party for different offices, went down. So people were just voting more like partisans when they lost local newspapers. And we hypothesized really that people were substituting local news for national news when they lost a local newspaper. You know, I still want to read the news, but since local doesn't exist, I'm going to go national. One newspaper in Palm Springs, California read that article, the executive editor, Julie Mackinnon, read that article and said, let's do something about it. And so they decided to drop national politics from their opinion page for an entire month. And we thought, well, this ought to lower the temperature a bit, not actually in Palm Springs where it's 120 Fahrenheit in July, but it might make things make the overall content less polarizing, refocus on Palm Springs, refocus on California. And we found that according to 2 measures of polarization, to your point about survey measures, one is distance, right? Like I said before, affective polarization is a sort of poorly named academic term for, do you like the other side? Do you like them or not? People increasingly don't. You ask them to rate people from the other side, Republicans or Democrats, from 0 to 100, their side's higher, the other side's lower. We found that decreased in Palm Springs over that month of July relative to a relatively similar comparison community, Ventura, California. The other measure is one of my favorite survey questions that we ask as a field, which is, how would you feel if your child married someone from the opposing party? So let's think about this question. It means you're going to be forced to interact with them for a very long time. It means that you're maybe, I don't know, it means a lot of things to people. It's a question that carries a lot of weight. But it's also just about like interacting with someone from the opposing party when you may not, that's not just your choice. That's not just you selecting your own social networks. And so that also went down in terms of the, people saying that they would either not care or be fine with it. That went up. People saying that they would be horrified by it went down. I think that we should keep in mind that social aspect of things. When we're talking about polarization, it's not just about roll call votes. It's not just about the temperature of media discussion around the country and how people rate the other side based on that. It's about how you actually interact with people in your everyday lives. And that, I think, also implicates local media because that's about people in your community as well, people you might actually see and interact with. The further we abstract politics away from people we're actually interacting with on a day-to-day basis, the more polarized we're going to get because the distance increases.
If you were to talk in real terms, do you think that you have any examples of where local reporting has had an impact on the way that people vote?
The way that people vote, that's an interesting question. I think there's ways that I think perhaps journalists think about measuring local news impact and that sort of thing. And then there's how I think this is actually working. Not to put too fine a point on it, but like there are, again, in terms of how people voted with regard to a local news story, that would happen largely as you would expect, where like a story comes out that looks bad for the politician, et cetera. Given that the industry is in complete free fall, I think we are perhaps better off thinking about that in terms of something that's really hard to prove, which is all the things that didn't happen because you had local news around, right? You can think about places that don't have as good of local news. These often are not rural news deserts. They might just be a far-flung suburb or something. You can think about a place like, I think one of the most famous ones is in Bell, California, which is a suburb of Los Angeles, where there was massive corruption happening, but they didn't have their own local news, and it was too far away for the LA Times to get out there very much. And so just incredible corruption going on that they were able to eventually figure out. That might be the kind of story that has an impact. But how many Bells are we not finding right now? How many places are out there that are just, what David Simon, the creator of The Wire, said recently, it's a great time to be a corrupt politician because nobody's watching. And so I think that we think too often about an individual story that's going to win you an award, or how audiences are reacting to a steady stream of news coverage. And I think we're thinking perhaps less about the massive institutional changes that are occurring, where people are not being overseen, there's not as much oversight from the media of like, I'm going to report the things you're saying and doing. And as a result, we should expect them to act like it. There's a wonderful study from economics showing that where there is worse news coverage for a reasonable reason, not because the news organization's bad, but because there's a lot of congressional districts in one media market, or because the media market overlaps between state lines, those legislators skip committee meetings. They don't bring as much money back home. They vote the party line instead of their own constituency's best interests more often. And so the performance of politicians, we should expect it to be worse where there isn't local news. It's just really hard to prove a counterfactual. So that's more how I think about it than like this one story made a difference. It's the stories that aren't getting written are making a difference. We just don't see it.
That's fair.
Yeah, before that.
Could you speak just a little closer to the mic?
Oh, yeah, sure.
Yeah. Thank you for telling us about this. Maybe a question, because you've mentioned the nationalization of like news media. But is there like a trend, like a worldwide kind of having larger media houses taking over more local, regional ones? Would you like to comment on this?
So I think the consolidation of local news outlets under the umbrella of larger companies, or perhaps as smaller aspects of a national brand, right? I think that might be the case here, and unfortunately I'm a typical Americanist political scientist where I don't actually know as much as I should about other countries. I'm very glad to be here. I just saw, for example, like the BBC has decided they're going to do more local news. There's larger, it's different in other countries, right, than America, because you've got more centralized national government. There's actually more of a need for national coverage. You don't have the long tradition that of independent local presses in very small communities like you do in America. You know, I think of Alexis de Tocqueville's Democracy in America, where he was like, you guys have a lot of newspapers. What is that? What's that about? That was back in the early 1800s. And so there's going to be different regulatory environments in other countries. It's something that I would argue you need to watch out for, because what happens in America today, now that you don't have the sort of localism requirements and you have the ability to buy up a lot of individual news outlets, is that hedge funds have taken over. Hedge funds have gotten into the game, and their only concern is making more money than they did the month before. And so they buy a local newspaper. Research from Joanna Dunaway and Eric Peterson, who I've written with, shows that they cut roughly 14% of staff almost immediately. They sell off the downtown headquarters. A lot of these newspapers in America have really valuable, beautiful old buildings downtown that they used to be reporting out of. Now they're in an office park in the suburbs because the hedge fund wanted to sell their building. This even happened, I'm from Boston, this happened to the Boston Globe. They sold the newspaper for $73 million and turned around and sold the building for 80. And so you're getting less local, fewer reporters, simply by dint of who's buying the paper. And if those, on one hand, maybe you could say they could share resources in this time where the industry is declining, what actually happens is the coverage gets worse. And so it's different where you've got actual state-supported news networks, and you've got different regulatory environments and different structure of politics. And I would argue we have to pay attention to how politics is structured if we're going to make sense of how local versus national news can make an impact. Watch out for the hedge funds. If they haven't found you, they will. And to the extent that that can be prevented, I think that's worthwhile.
Okay. I think we've run out of time, so do we open the floor to questions? All right. So, any questions?
If you have any questions, please do come to one of the microphones, or we'll try and pass one to you.
Try this again. Yes, now this works. If you have any questions, please do come to one of the mics in the alleys, or raise your hand if you're really stuck, so we can get one to you. Please go ahead.
Hi, so Rudy Rosenberg, freelance reporter for a hedge fund-owned company. And also a teacher here at the School of Journalism. I was wondering if you could comment on on some of the statistics that we saw about the confidence or the trust that audiences still have in local media versus national media, and why that delta exists. Thank you.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's a really important question, because it is one of the few advantages that local news still has within the marketplace for news today. People give a benefit to things that are local to them, that are proximate to them. This is actually, I have a paper coming out about this actually, hopefully soon, that really tries to break down where that local news advantage comes from, trust advantage comes from. It emerged in the mid-90s. Before that, they were basically the same. Part of that paper is a meta-analysis of the polls on this. People tend to have much more affinity for their specific local news outlets than for the broader category of local news, which I don't think they necessarily know how to make sense of. But what we find, and this speaks to the rise of a phenomenon that we have at least in the US, probably elsewhere, called pink slime news, where people are putting up fake local news sites that essentially look like local news sites, but are basically just republishing, repurposing statistics, press releases, and occasionally injecting some ideological content in there to try to take advantage of that trust advantage and persuade people. And so what we found in our experiments is that roughly half the local news trust advantage can be explained by just having a local name. The other half is probably due to the experience people have with that paper, their ability to read it, the fact that they recognize the brand name. But this is perhaps most problematic because a lot of the best local news that's happening these days is happening at nonprofits like the Texas Tribune, or like nonprofits that have opened in recent years. And unlike the Texas Tribune, a lot of them don't have very local sounding names. And so people don't know what to make of them, and they don't have that half of local trust that's based on experience. And if they don't have that half that's based on sounding local, we find in several experiments that really high quality local nonprofit news, members of the Institute for Nonprofit News, good journalism happening nonprofit locally, is being rated as less trusted than pink slime when people encounter it for the first time. And so it's explained by that local personal connection, but people are just trying to make sense of this new news environment, and they're grabbing onto things that sound local. And so it's really something to watch going forward. But I think like we can't just take that trust advantage for granted. We need to understand where it comes from and adjust accordingly.
Okay, we'll go to you, please.
Yeah, hi. Thank you for highlighting the whole hedge fund issue, but I was wondering what other alternative you would think about concerning, because that happens for a reason, because they need money. So yeah, what other options are there? Yes, so I think that chain ownership is inherently going to result in some less local news because of information sharing and resource sharing and that sort of thing. More regional than local, perhaps. Again, the problem with hedge funds is that it's kind of a short-term model with regard to spiking profits now and who cares later. I think if there was more of an emphasis, as is happening, I would argue, in Colorado, where there's a local news trust that's buying up dying news sources there and not treating it like a hedge fund. Perhaps this should also be happening locally and at the state level, because national solutions to local problems don't always work, even in the industry. There has to be an alternative who's willing to buy up these sources. The other model of sort of local newspaper as local vanity project for a local rich person, which I won't complain about because many of the journalism schools in the United States are named after those people, who then reinvested in journalism education, right? Good things to do. That's not really a model. That's just, does the person who's wealthy in that community want to buy that paper? Again, I'm from Boston. The Boston Globe is owned by the owner of the Boston Red Sox, right? So, don't expect too much critical Red Sox coverage. But it's been a real change in the industry, and unless there's a similar approach from people who want to preserve it, it's going to keep going to the people who want to milk it for all it's worth and leave it for dead.
Thank you, Joshua Darr, and our star interviewers. Thank you.